There. Welcome to the EIS Equality Fringe meeting, which unusually is happening the evening before Congress, our conference starts, and unusually is happening online. You're very welcome to this today, and we really appreciate people signing up for this when it's been such a difficult year and such a very busy term. And we're also very appreciative of the speakers who are giving up this time to address us this evening. So we have speakers from a range of different equality organisations for you this evening. We have Emma Rich from Engender, Neil Cowan from the Poverty Alliance, Jordan Daly from the Tag Campaign, Heather Fiskin from Inclusion Scotland, and Dilraj Watson from Amina, the Muslim Women's Resource Centre. And each of our speakers will speak for around 10 minutes, and then there will be questions afterwards. Just a reminder that we are recording this event this evening, so if you just make you aware of that, if you have any concerns about that, you can contact the department about it. The hashtag for the Fringe meeting is hashtag EIS Equal Recovery, and if you are posting anything about the event, we'd love you to use the hashtag. Just to let everyone know, there will be some questions at the end from some members who submitted those already, and between the speakers and the questions, we will take a short break for a few minutes, just because one of our speakers has somebody transcribing for them, and it's to give that person a break, because obviously that is quite hard work. So there'll be just a very short few minutes between the speakers and the questions at the beginning. We have so much structural inequality built into our society, colleagues, that it is no surprise that things get worse under when a crisis occurs. And it's hard to think of a greater crisis than the one in which we have lived for the last 15 months or so. I noticed a couple of years ago that one of the opposition parties appointed a shadow minister for inequality, and it struck me that actually that sends quite a strong message, that that's how bad things can be in terms of equality, that actually somebody's appointed for inequality rather than equality itself. We have a precarious society for so many reasons, many of which, we should be clear, are a choice made by successive governments in different administrations. And it's also the case that it's too easy for government, for the media, and for wider society to decide that schools can and should fix everything. But as a previous colleague of ours used to say, he was a local association secretary for Glasgow, Hugh Donnelly, and he used to say, we have horns, not wands. And the idea that we can fix absolutely everything for society is an erroneous one. We need wider societal change. And organisations like the EIS and other trade unions and the wider equality movement are continuing to push hard for that wider societal change. So I would like to introduce our first speaker this evening, who is Emma Rich from Engender. Emma is Executive Director of Engender, which is Scotland's feminist policy organisation working on women's social, economic and political equality in Scotland. Emma leads Engender's strategic collaboration with colleagues in the women's, equalities and human rights sectors, and engagement with the Scottish and UK government, the United Nations and the EU through the European Women's Lobby. Prior to this, she was manager of Close the Gap for 9 years and worked extensively on women's labour market participation. Emma sits in a range of external working groups, including the Joint Strategic Board of Equally Safe, Scottish National Action Plan for Human Rights Leadership Forum, the Scottish Women's Rights Centre and the Scottish Women's Budget Group. She chairs the Rape Crisis Scotland Board, is vice-convener of the Board of Close the Gap, and is a member of the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls. We're very lucky to have Emma come to speak to us today, and I will hand over to Emma now. Normally I would ask for a welcoming round of applause, but we can't really do that online. But I'd like to hand over to Emma, and you're very welcome to address the Fringe meeting now. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks so much, Nicola, for that really warm welcome. And it's such a pleasure to be here with EIS colleagues and comrades this evening. I appreciate that many of you will be joining after a long working day. So I will, I hope, be brief, but talking about the experience that women have had during the pandemic. So, what we knew going into the pandemic, as soon as it started to happen, women's organisations were talking to Scottish Government and other decision makers about the things we've learned from other pandemics around the world. So we knew three main things. We knew that women would be at higher risk from the disease itself. Women are more likely to be healthcare workers, domestic workers, are more likely to be doing unpaid care. are more likely to be doing the shopping and housework, to be using public transport, and all of these features of everyday life place women at the front line of risk. And we also know from other pandemics around the world, like Zika, Ebola, SARS, that during a pandemic, when people are restricted to home, violence against women, especially domestic abuse, increases in propensity and also in severity. And that's because perpetrators have much more control over where women go and what women are doing. The second thing we knew about pandemics was that when pandemics hit, spending and delivery of programs on women and girls tend to be deprioritized. And that's often because money shifts to some of the public health initiatives and away from women's health, especially reproductive health. There's also often a reduction in spend on girls' education and on equality programs that are happening in all kinds of contexts, including in schools. And I think one of the questions that's already been put forward that Nicola will be outlining later refers to that. The third thing we know is that there tends to be a bit of a defocusing on equalities issues and on women and girls. And so we see a lot of generic public health programs that overlook the specific needs of Black and minoritized women, disabled women, all women. And sometimes the equality decision making that is present in government and other institutions becomes rushed or missing. And we've heard a lot over the last wee while, oh, we need to really quickly respond to this issue. We just don't have time to think about girls and women. Before COVID-19, women obviously were not equal, and the trade union movement has known that and advocated around that for many a long year. 68% of the care for sick people, older people and disabled people and childcare was done by women, and that's measuring all of the childcare and care done in Scotland. Women's day-to-day lives were a juggle before COVID, and they depended on really piecing together a jigsaw of a lot of public services, some services provided by companies, and also the unpaid care from family and friends. And they relied on this piecing together of transport systems, nursery and school provision, the way supermarkets worked, after school care, grandparents' care, to make them livable and make them endurable. And during COVID, obviously, a lot of these systems and services started to change in the way they were delivered. And that placed incredible strain on the way a lot of women in Scotland were living their lives. And so what happened was women started to provide a lot more care to sick people, disabled people and older people as services were withdrawn and service packages were withdrawn. Women ended up doing a lot more housework and a lot more childcare, including supervising homeschooling. And as a consequence, women started doing a lot less paid work. So unpaid work up and paid work down. And that added up, we worked out with economist colleagues at the University of Caledonian to about £15 million worth of work less being done by women every day in Scotland during the pandemic. And that was for a whole host of reasons, including the amount they were being interrupted when trying to do their paid work at home, but also women consciously deciding that they just couldn't make their lives work with all of these services withdrawn. And so they began to step back from the labour market. This obviously presents a huge risk to women's economic equality, something which the labour movement and EIS has been advocating for and struggling for all of its lifetime. So the real risk, we think, is that at the moment, women are completely exhausted. We've had a programme during COVID where we've asked women to tell us what's happening in their lives, in their households, in their families, what's going on with them and work. And women are describing a situation to us now where they've used up every resource they could during the pandemic to make things functional for themselves. They've run out of toil, they've run out of annual leave, they've run out of flexi time. They don't have any more left in the tank in order to compensate for the fact that they're being asked to do so much on the home front and so much on the work front. I really hope that we are now heading out of lockdown. I'm sure we all hope we're heading out into a Scotland where we can move around a bit more and get back to the ways that we were working and living before. But there do seem to be public health risks, and there are new variants that could potentially mean that we might be heading back into some form of lockdown at some point during the autumn and winter, or there might be changes to the way services are delivered in order to deal with the public health consequences. Women just don't have very much more to give in terms of trying to compensate for those public services that haven't been restored. And so what we are seeing is women are stopping doing that paid work that they had been doing previously to the extent which they'd been doing it previously. And a lot of women have told us they're really scared for their careers. They weren't able to work the same hours as men during lockdown, and so they're now wondering if they will be seen as the most valued workers in their workplaces, if they'll be in line for promotions or progression of any kind. They're really concerned about how some of what has happened during lockdown will be thought about as the future unfolds. And because that is happening right across Scotland, we are very, very concerned that the patterns where men are seen as the workers, women are seen as the carers, becomes more and more of a reality. And we start to get into a spiral where we see some of the equality gains that women have made over the last decades rolling back, that women's inequality will widen, gaps will widen, the pay gap will widen. But I think there is some hope and some optimism, and I think as ever there is a place for trade unions to be working hard and struggling against those kinds of dynamics. And the first thing I would encourage EIS and its members to think about is how much we now need a revolution in unpaid work. Workers have struggled together to change the conditions under which people work, but we haven't really seen much of a struggle in terms of the unpaid work that women particularly do, although men obviously do as well. And that is often not seen as an economic issue, but an issue of choice and an issue of individual families individually making decisions. Actually, there are lots of systems that really, really constrain how families can best decide what to do for themselves. And we think that we need to see unpaid work reducing. We need to see services increasing, state services increasing to fill some care gaps. We need a reallocation of unpaid work to the state, and we need unpaid work to be revalued. At the moment, it's treated exactly the same as sitting on the sofa and watching telly in terms of how economically productive it is and how socially productive it is often. We need this to be a key trade union issue. Secondly, we need trade unions to keep advocating and agitating for a recovery for women. We need to see a care economy that values both paid and unpaid work. We need a reduction in precarity, including in education. And we need to ensure that when we talk about economic buzzwords like inclusive growth, that type of growth, that type of economic thinking includes women as well. And finally, I feel like we're currently seeing a real backlash against lots of different equality calls. We're seeing a really hostile and right-wing press amplifying UK government thinking, which is really opposed to some of the equality gains that trade unions have fought for in the last decades. So I'd urge you to keep fighting for equality. The meeting that you're holding tonight is really positive. You do great equality work within EIS. And I would really urge you to keep pushing forward for gender mainstreaming, where women and girls are thought about when policymakers and politicians are making decisions. I'd urge you to keep understanding what is happening in women workers' lives, including all of the teachers who have borne a huge amount of the burden for keeping things going during the pandemic. And I would urge you to keep going again with your specific equality campaigns for equal pay, for progressive education. And I know you'll hear from Jordan from the Thai campaign that we really support. But keep going with all of that vital work to make schools, workplaces and Scotland a better place for women and girls. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a sweepy how many times I'm going to speak without unmuting myself this evening. I'll try and make that the first and last time. So thank you so much, Emma. You were exemplary in terms of your timekeeping, but not only that, what you said there has given us so much food for thought. And you know, really, we have to keep our eye on what's happening with women and fight for the unpaid work that they're doing to be valued and understood as such a great value to society. So thank you so much for joining us and speaking to us this evening. I did mean to say I'll try and give the speakers a 1 minute warning when they're coming close to time. I didn't want to cut across Emma and do that because I hadn't warned you, I might. So thank you so much again to Emma for speaking to us. And could I turn now to Neil Cowan from the Poverty Alliance. Neil is Policy and Campaigns Manager at the Poverty Alliance, the national anti-poverty network in Scotland. Neil leads the organisation's influencing and campaigning activities, and prior to joining the organisation in March 2018, he worked in policy and public affairs roles for charities including the Hepatitis C Trust, the British Red Cross and the Refugee Council. Neil has an MA in Politics and English Literature and an MSc in International Politics from the University of Glasgow. And again, we can't give Neil a welcoming round of applause, but I would like to extend a very warm welcome to him this evening and ask him to address the meeting. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks very much, Nicola. And I don't have any snazzy slides like Emma, so you'll have to rely on my voice alone, unfortunately. So yeah, thank you very much to EIS for inviting me today. Really, really good to be with you, albeit virtually, and to be a part of this discussion. So I'm Neil Cowan, Policy Campaigns Manager at the Poverty Alliance, which is a national anti-poverty network in Scotland. So we're made up of around 400 organisations from across Scotland, so community organisations, NGOs, trade unions, faith groups and others, all of whom are committed to solving poverty in Scotland. So I think it's important for me to say firstly that even before the pandemic, levels of poverty in Scotland were an outrage, and there's no other word for it. And we know that even before the pandemic, over 1 million people in Scotland were living in the grip of poverty, including around 1 in 4 children. And I think, in Scotland, we often think of ourselves as being a just and compassionate society. And I think actually, on the whole, we probably are. Yet over 1 million people, almost 1 in 4 children, pre-pandemic were living in poverty. And I think that very clearly shows that something has been going seriously wrong with the way that we organise our economy and our society for them to create such hardship and such gross injustice. Emma's already touched upon, and I'm sure others in the panel will cover much more articulately than me, that this injustice and this inequality isn't evenly distributed, and poverty is intrinsically linked to the many other inequalities, whether of gender, race, ethnicity, disability, migration status, sexuality, that mark our society in Scotland. And what that means is that even before the pandemic, we know that it was particular people in our society who were most likely to experience poverty because of those interconnecting forms of injustice. So women, especially women who are lone parents, for example, disabled people, people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, people with insecure immigration status, among others. So this was the case even pre-pandemic. But there's no question that the pandemic has really embedded and entrenched these inequalities and embedded and entrenched the experience of poverty for many, many people across our communities in Scotland. So we know, for example, that while the furlough scheme has protected many people from even greater hardship, the impact of the pandemic on the labour market has still been seismic over the last year and a bit. So many people who are already in low paid or insecure work, and again, it's important to say that people in low paid and insecure work are disproportionately women, disproportionately young, disproportionately disabled, and disproportionately from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. They saw their employment disappear or their working hours cut. And if they qualified for furlough, that still meant a 20% cut a lot of the time to their wages. And obviously, if you're in low paid, insecure work, a 20% cut is quite substantial. So for many, many people over the last year and a bit, the grip of poverty is very much tightened. And we saw that manifest itself in, for example, the huge rise in food bank use at the start of the pandemic, something that's really continued in the months since. But again, it's really important to remember that food bank use didn't begin last March with the onset of the virus, and that food bank use has been rising in Scotland and across the UK for the last decade or so, primarily driven by cuts in social security. And what these cuts in social security have meant is that our social security system too often acts to pull people into rather than protecting them from poverty and from hardship. So policies like, for example, the benefit cap, which is unjust and arbitrary, the 2-child limit, which is cruel and which is a blatant breach of women's rights, and the 5-week wait for universal credit. Policies like these and more combine to lock people really tightly into poverty. And again, really important to emphasise that these policies existed pre-pandemic, pre-virus, and our social security system was inadequate before the pandemic. The pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated that inadequacy, and we now need it to be fixed so that it doesn't continue to be inadequate when the pandemic is over. And I suppose that's kind of my key message. The equality impact of the pandemic has been extreme, but the inequalities and the poverty that the pandemic has exposed and is entrenched are, I think, as we all know, long-standing and are a direct result of decisions that have been made over many years about how we design our economy, how we organise our society, and where power lies within them. And I think for me, the real risk is that as we emerge, hopefully, eventually, from the pandemic, that there is a return to normal, and it's a reinforcement of the kind of structures that create the kind of injustice that I've spoken about and that we all know about, and a return to the economic and social policies that combine to create the obscene levels of poverty and inequality that we have in Scotland and across the UK. And I think we very simply and obviously can't allow that to happen. With specific regards to poverty and education, as this is obviously an EIS event, I'm sure you all as EIS members know all too well what the impacts of poverty can be on the lives and life chances of the children and young people that you work with. So whether it's children whose parents are around at home to help them with homework because they're working late night shifts and low paid insecure jobs, or whether it's children that are struggling to concentrate in class because food is scarce at home because their parents had to choose between food on the table or paying rent. I'm sure many of you see every day the impact that poverty can have. And I'm sure you've also seen how the impact of the pandemic has been most strongly felt by the children and young people you work with who are from low-income families. And schools and teachers do have a big role to play in supporting children and young people from families on low incomes. Obviously, schools can help to alleviate some of the impacts of poverty. They can help to reduce stigma. They can reduce the cost of the school day to relieve some pressure on families. And Child Poverty Action Group do brilliant work on that in partnership with a number of local authorities. But I think it's really, really important to say, and Nicola, I think, touched upon this at the start, that schools cannot solve poverty. And I worry often that the onus on closing the attainment gap is put on schools and it's put on teachers, rather than on the kind of economic and social structures and policies that are actually driving the unequal educational outcomes that we see. Because I think we know that the attainment gap is already often pretty much baked in by the time that children start school. And schools can obviously, and they must, do their bit to close the attainment gap. I know that there's brilliant work that takes place across Scotland in schools to close that gap. But for as long as almost 1 in 4 children are growing up in poverty, schools are fighting that with one hand, maybe even two hands behind their backs. And the only way that we can, for example, close the attainment gap is by tackling poverty and tackling inequality. And we'll do that by redesigning our economy and redesigning our public services so that they actually reflect the values of justice and compassion that we all profess to share. So that means action to boost incomes, reduce the cost of living, and ensure that power is shared in a more just way. And we can do that. And for me, there's huge possibilities that we have to advance equality and to tackle poverty in our recovery from the pandemic. So we know that the UK government has an enormous role to play in terms of, for example, fixing our social security system. So it can end the 5-week wait, it can end the benefit cap, it can end the 2-child limit, it can make sure that benefits are actually adequate. All these things can be done and must be done. But the Scottish Government can also take action right now. So it could immediately, for example, double the Scottish Child Payment, which is a new £10 per week benefit for low-income families. It could extend free bus travel to all under 25s and to people on low incomes. It could expand free childcare provision, something that would be of particular benefit to women, particularly women who are lone parents. It can increase financial support for unpaid carers, again, disproportionately women. And it can ensure that disability benefits, which will soon be getting delivered in Scotland, actually protect people from poverty and are actually adequate. And these things, I think it's all really, really important to remember, are eminently achievable and doable. And I really sense, maybe I've been too optimistic, but I really sense that the last year has opened up people's eyes to the gross levels of inequality that exist in our society. I think that more people than ever before have seen the result of economic and social policies More people than ever before have been exposed themselves to our social security system. More people than ever before also saw, I think importantly, that it is actually possible to enact huge, bold policies at speed. So, last year we essentially ended rough sleeping last year. We banned evictions. We got emergency cash payments to families who were struggling to stay afloat. And these things were done because governments decided they should be done, because they were prioritised and they made them happen. And it just shows what can be achieved. And I think people have seen that over the past year. And I think it's really important to kind of keep hold of that. We now have a new Scottish Parliament, and for us, this Parliament has to be one that turns some of the rhetoric that we see in Holyrood about creating a fairer, more equal Scotland into reality.
That's 1 minute, please, Neil. Thank you.
Perfect, that's no worries. So, the impact of the pandemic on inequality has been huge, as we all know, but we really can fix it. It's just about making it a priority and a government priority, being bold and taking different decisions to ones that have been taken in the past. And I think there's huge possibilities, huge opportunities, but it's really just up to us, by which I mean folk concerned about tackling poverty, to work together to make sure those opportunities are seized by every level of government. Yeah, that's my 10 minutes up. So that's pretty much, that is all from me. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this, and yeah, looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you for coming and speaking to us today, and for outlining the fact that a lot of this is down to economic choice and highlighting all the injustices that are leading people into poverty at the moment. And I think it's such an important point that you were saying towards the end there, that it just shows what they can do if they want to when it comes to government spending. So thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Jordan Daly from the Time for Inclusive Education campaign. Jordan is co-founder and director of TIE, Scotland's LGBT inclusive education charity, which supports schools to take an educational approach to tackling homophobic, biphobic and transphobic prejudice and bullying. So again, no round of applause, just an imaginary one, Jordan, and we'll hand over to you and ask you to address the meeting. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you, EIS, for having me. Can I just check? I have just entered full screen on my laptop. Can you all see this full screen? Yeah, perfect. Okay, I can see Emma's nodding, so you can be my signpost, Emma, to make sure my tech's working right. So hello, my name's Jordan. I am a co-founder and one of the directors of Time for Inclusive Education. We are a Scottish charity. We were founded in 2015, and I think I know most of you on the call. I think we've worked together in some format or in some way in the past. So very briefly, for those who might not know who we are or what we do, we ultimately believe in taking an educational approach to tackling the prejudice, stereotypes and stigma that can lead to the bullying and isolation often experienced by LGBT young people or young people who are perceived or thought to be LGBT by others. So what that looks like for us is the advancement of LGBT inclusive education, which means including LGBT and broader equalities learning themes across curriculum content from broad general education to senior phase. So that can mean teaching young people about different people from LGBT history, different events or moments from LGBT history, as well as an education which is embedded in learning about human rights, about inequalities, prejudice, stereotypes, bullying, and so on. We work at a national level. We have a teachers panel on our organisation of teachers across the country who co-develop resources and CPD for us, and we also deliver services in school. I am going to apologise because my voice, this is the fourth or fifth, I think, online event. We've done 3 CPD sessions throughout today, and they were all roughly 2 hours each. So I'm totally talked out. So I'm going to try my best, but I keep getting a dry throat. So what I wanted to talk to you about for the AGM is not what we normally do, which is about curriculum and how you can include LGBT inclusive education in curriculum. I wanted to talk to you about our report, Online in Lockdown, which was released last summer. We partnered with Professor Ian Rivers from Strathclyde University, who's one of our trustees, and together we worked on a 6-week research period where 1,015 young people across all local authority areas in Scotland told us the impact of the first COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, which began in March 2020. In this report, Online in Lockdown, we explored three overarching thematic areas. So one was well-being, what we wanted to know, what impact the lockdown was having on young people's emotional well-being. We also wanted to know what impact lockdown was having on young people's experiences of online bullying. And we wanted to know what impact the lockdown was having on young people's experiences of online prejudice. Now, as far as we know, it is still the only data set currently in the UK which not only looked at young people's emotional well-being, but explored their experiences of online bullying and online prejudice during lockdown, as we as a nation, as a world, moved onto the internet in much larger capacity with the lockdown. What we were interested in as an education charity is what impact is this having when it comes to online bullying and online prejudice. The full report's available to read at tie.scot/reports. There is a specific data breakdown which highlights the experiences of LGBT young people, and there's also a breakdown by gender as well, looking at any gender differences, as well as a breakdown specifically for school pupils and also college and university students as well. So I'm going to talk you through some of the findings of the report. For those who haven't read it or weren't aware of it, and towards the end I want to just talk about kind of some of the lessons that we can learn from this and what it tells us that learners in our school need to know as we look to hopefully moving into a post-COVID society. So in terms of what we found at a purely snapshot level for all respondents, 47% of young people who participated had seen or experienced bullying during that 6-week period during the first lockdown, and they reported that this had been happening at a higher rate than usual. When it comes to online prejudice, 59% of young people had witnessed prejudice-based posts, comments, or attitudes online. And for all respondents in this research, the most common forms of prejudice-based posts, comments, or attitudes seen were related to racism, homophobia, and body image or physical appearance. For LGBT young people specifically, what we found was that over 1 in 4, 36% of LGBT young people reported that they had directly experienced online bullying during the lockdown period, while 30% of LGBT young people reported that they had seen other people being bullied online. For LGBT young people, as well as all demographics of young people, the most common kind of bullying was what we would call stranger bullying, where the perpetrator isn't known. What young people told us and the qualitative input that we received was that they often could not be entirely sure who was carrying out the bullying. It would often come from anonymous accounts or pseudonym profiles. It would come from, it wouldn't be like a Facebook friend whose name you could identify and picture you could identify. It would often be anonymous. And what we found was that often had a kind of added sinister edge to the experience of the bullying, that for the young person, it's particularly pernicious, this type of online bullying, in the sense that the young person is unable to actually identify who is doing this to them. So quite a number of young people spoke about, and the qualitative input, a number of young people spoke about how not only were they experiencing bullying behaviours or experiencing prejudice-based posts and messages, but that they were unable to tell who that was, and that caused quite a heightened sense of paranoia, fear and alarm, and also felt like normal routes to support were cut off to them, and so they were retreating and keeping that to themselves. In terms of rates of online bullying, so we asked about rates of frequency because that could help us understand whether the online bullying that was seen and or experienced by young people had spiked as young people spent more time online, or whether it was just stagnating. And what we found was the former, the online bullying rates had spiked as young people moved onto online platforms. So for LGBT young people, 76% of them said that their experiences of online bullying during the lockdown period had been happening more than usual. And this was the same across all demographics of young people. They were all quite unanimous in that they had seen or experienced much higher rates of bullying than they previously did. For online prejudice, now online prejudice can be defined as prejudice-based comments, posts, attitudes, rumour spreading, online harassment experienced by young people on the basis of particular characteristics. So 72% of LGBT young people reported that they had seen a higher level of online prejudice during the lockdown period. For comparison, and also alarmingly high, 48% of heterosexual young people reported the same. LGBT young people also reported seeing higher rates of online prejudice than their heterosexual peers, but the other thing that differed between LGBT young people and their peers were the types of prejudice that they reported and the rate at which they witnessed them. So the most common forms of online prejudice for all young people were homophobia, racism, and prejudice related to body image or physical appearance. The most common forms of online prejudice for LGBT young people were homophobia. So over half of LGBT young people had witnessed or experienced homophobia online. Racism, 55% of LGBT young people had experienced or witnessed racism online. And transphobia, just under half, 48% of LGBT young people had witnessed or experienced transphobia online. LGBT young people reported seeing homophobia online at more than double the rate of their peers, while they reported seeing biphobia and transphobia online at more than triple the rate of their peers. And they were also more likely to report seeing sexism or misogyny online, as well as comments or posts related to body image and physical appearance. Now, in the actual report, we do a little bit of a deep dive into why this might have been the case. So what we can't say is that...
That's a 1 minute warning, please.
Okay.
Thank 1 minute left. Thank you.
So we done a deep dive into this to try and figure out why this was happening. And what we can say is that young people who experience one type of prejudice are often more alert to or able to identify different types of prejudice. So in terms of the lessons that the report gave us, there are 6 key things that young people should know when we're thinking about recovery curriculum or when we're thinking about going back, particularly as we're coming up to summer break. Young people are going to be on these platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter. So they need to know what online bullying looks like. They need to know what they're doing if they're experiencing online bullying. They have to know what to do if they witness someone else being bullied online, and they have to know what to do if they witness prejudicial comments or posts online, and if they're on the receiving end of that. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, they also have to know how to build online resilience for positive well-being. How can they keep themselves safe, and how can they ensure that they are not impacted by what they experience online? I'm not going to run through the next 2 slides, but I am going to just leave them here if any of the teachers on the call want to screenshot them. I can also send them out to Andrea and Nicola afterwards to be posted out, but we've got some key tips for young people as well as key tips for teachers and educators about what to do in terms of online bullying and prejudice. And summarising, I will leave this slide of signposting for you. There's a number of organisations that can help over these 3 key themes, but the key thing ultimately, what this tells us is that young people experience online prejudice, they experience online bullying in the same way that we can pick up our phones and witness this behaviour. Young people share those platforms with us, so it does give further emphasis to when we're thinking about curriculum development post-COVID. We need to ensure that we're approaching it with an equalities lens and that we're ensuring that some of these key areas impacting LGBT young people are included in our curriculum development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And I'm so sorry to cut you off there. I know it's really hard, and there's so much, for you to tell us. And I think, it's so important to know the extent to which LGBT plus young people are experiencing this. And I think many colleagues on the call will be horrified by the scale of it that you've just described there. And thank you for speaking to us today when, you've clearly had a very long day. It shows how much demand you're in, and we do appreciate it. And I hope you're able to rest your voice for a little while at least for the rest of the evening. So thank you for that, Jordan. Moving on now to Heather Fiskin, who is Interim Director, Head of Policy and Research Team at Inclusion Scotland. Heather works to ensure that policy change takes account of disabled people's lived experience and priorities for change to bring about fairer Scotland. Inclusion Scotland is a disabled people's organisation and leads the Scottish civil society group reporting to the UN on the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People and its application in Scotland. Besides overseeing Inclusion Scotland's policy and research responses to COVID-19, Heather also oversees their work on social security, poverty, employment, Brexit, access to justice, climate change, and our Highland project to work with Highland disabled people to build a regional network. She previously worked for the Disability Rights Commission and Equality and Human Rights Commission and was a committee member of the Scottish Government's Mobility Access Committee Scotland and has been a trustee of RNID, the National Register for Communication Professionals for Deaf People. So you're very welcome here this evening, Heather, and I'd like to ask you to address the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and good evening. It's lovely to be here. I'm really pleased that EIS is looking at this as an agenda ahead of your conference. It's very heartening to see that. Nicola said, I work for Inclusion Scotland, and I think I'd like to start by saying we are a disabled people's organisation. It's important to make that distinction between DPOs and disability organisations. The reason for that is we are led by disabled people ourselves, and you'd be astonished how accepted it is for organisations promoting rights, etc. for disabled people to be led by boards and staff fully made up of non-disabled people, something you would not expect to see in a women's group, for example, and to be led by a committee of men, I'm sure. And the other thing is, I usually speak off the cuff, but today I'm using notes because COVID itself has had the most phenomenal, far-reaching and deep impact on disabled people's lives in Scotland. And I worry that I will not keep within the 10 minutes if I started talking as I normally do, so forgive me if I read notes. Inclusion Scotland promotes the social model of disability. It's important to understand that. We say that it is not the impairment or the person that disables somebody, it's the barriers that society has erected for disabled people, whether these be environmental, communication, attitudinal, organisational, and the cumulative impact of these barriers over years and other factors like age, gender, poverty, where you live. An example of this would be if a wheelchair user cannot get onto a bus. People say, well, fix the person, and we say, no, fix the bus. And so I just wanted to lay that out there before we started. So many things have happened and continue to happen to disabled people because of the pandemic. But I think first, and this follows on the approach that many of my panel colleagues have taken, it's important to understand the situation disabled people were in before the pandemic struck. And that goes for their families and their unpaid carers as well. So we were already one of the most marginalised and excluded in our society because of decades of discrimination and exclusion, austerity, welfare reform, as it's called, and policies which are designed with the chasm, if you like, between quite well-meaning policies, national strategies, etc., and how they are delivered on the ground for whatever reason. I think it was Emma who spoke about the press and the way that people are being presented in many areas of life were more likely to be unemployed and to earn less money than non-disabled people, to leave school with fewer qualifications, to live in poverty of income, health, fuel, heating, transport, access to services, and to report lower mental health outcomes, whether or not that is the reason why we are disabled, and the list goes on. So much so that several years ago, the United Nations, the last time it looked at the UK in terms of the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, found that the UK was engaged in systemic violation of our human rights. So at the time of COVID, one of the most striking facts I have had come out with this, and there are many striking facts, is that 6 out of every 10 deaths from COVID in Scotland were disabled people, even though disabled people only make up 18% of the population. Yes, at its core, COVID is a health issue, but it brought with it greatest social, economic and political issues, which aggravated and entrenched issues that we faced at the outset of the pandemic. And for disabled people and those in their household, they're not just at risk from the virus itself, we are at risk from the actions of public bodies and others who have not understood who we are what we need and what will work, simply because they have not asked. And this isn't a new state of affairs at all, and getting it wrong costs money and time, and it also costs life, as you will see from that statistic about 6 and 10. We did a very large survey last year and reported on that. It's called Rights at Risk on our website, and it uncovered many of the impacts, including the loss of home-based social care support, and social care support for people living at home was quite often withdrawn overnight, completely or partially, and without warning. And astonishingly, people were still being charged for that social care, and some still are being charged for social care that they are not receiving, which means that they can't spend the money in other ways. And people were forced to sleep in wheelchairs for weeks on end. And not everyone who needed to made it onto the official shielding list. I'm sure you all heard the First Minister and the Clinical Director talking about the shielding list at their daily updates, which is great. Yes, that gave people access to specific services and support, but a lot of people did not make it onto that list who needed to be on that list because their impairment was too rare or complex. Or it was not deemed to be of clinical risk, despite the fact that their own knowledge of their life and their experience of their impairment or health condition meant that they knew themselves that they would not receive or benefit from treatment. So basically, they were invisible from the services that they needed. I personally know of at least 15 people who have not been over their threshold since the start of the pandemic. And only just one of them only just left the house for the first time last week. One of the reasons for the high incidence of deaths of disabled people is that they were too scared to seek medical help. And that's in no small part due to fear of do not resuscitate notices, some of which were involuntary, and we do have evidence of that. That we're hoping that if in the future, when there is an inquiry into all this, that's one of the aspects that will be looked at closely. There is guidance about notices to not resuscitate people, as a clinicians should follow, but it appears they were not following them. And people also died because of lack of PPE, not just in care homes, but in their own homes, with carers who they employed coming in from other environments. But what could they do? It was a choice between that and not eating, was living in a wheelchair. Those living in poverty are less likely to have digital access to the internet to help maintain connections and to access vital information or to ask for support. Forced reliance on family members for care and support had an impact on those family relationships. And again, I think it was Emma who talked about the increase in violence, domestic violence, and parents of school-aged children who had behavioural issues or disabilities lost respite and felt very abandoned. That was one of the words that came out of the survey, and lacked the necessary skills to educate their own child or to support them to be educated. And these, some of the other issues uncovered this year include that, using these lateral flow tests, the information isn't accessible. Actually using it independently isn't accessible. People who are self-isolating as opposed to being on the shielding list are still waiting for vaccinations when they should have been prioritised in the second rollout of the vaccination. And disabled people who wear face coverings or cannot wear face coverings continue to be stigmatised. Those who lip read are often refuse legal treatment. They're requested to just write something down. If a service provider is wearing a mask, it's often not met. And there's also that phrase being used, cast as underlying health conditions. If you're sitting at home during this first few months of this pandemic, even now, it's almost as if it's okay. It's only those with underlying health conditions. How must that make people feel? So, we are beginning to emerge from this. Hopefully, we will not go backwards. But the conversation has moved to a recovery footing, and I noticed that the title tonight, Equality Matters in Recovery. However, everybody wants to recover their lives, freedoms, livelihoods, but disabled people actually don't want to recover the society that they lived in back in 2019. I thought a century there. We don't want to revisit a life where our exclusion and stigmatisation and poverty was so entrenched and untreated.
Hi, Heather. That's a 1-minute warning.
Okay,
Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. But if the responses to COVID have shown us one thing, it's that disabled people have to be involved in decision making, and it's a point that we're making across the board. I think also it's worth noticing that this pandemic is not going to be our only rodeo here, and climate change is going to bring its own disasters in the future. We've been looking into this in Inclusion Scotland, including exploring what happened in 2005 in America with Hurricane Katrina. I don't know if people are aware of the research that was done after that, but evidence was uncovered of many hundreds of disabled people and older people who were tied to their wheelchairs and beds and left to drown because there was no protocols in place to evacuate them. People did not know how to evacuate them. There was no capacity to evacuate them. Yes, and that is probably an extreme example, but it goes to show that you have to involve people in the development of protocols and the planning, and you have to also, above everything else, respect people's human rights. And we're also seeing a number of creeping barriers coming in. For example, in the hospitality industry, we thought we'd get rid of this, people using accessible toilets to store the staff case handbags, etc. But the chairs, the surplus chairs and tables that have been removed are now in the accessible toilet. You'll have noticed that lots of pubs and hotels, etc., are building decking is in situ trees. I think the most important thing, of course, is to reduce poverty in Scotland and its impact, including revisiting the initiatives around employability, increasing benefits to reflect rising costs, and to make social care through and to meet unmet social care needs. And finally, very finally, COVID has disproportionately interfered with our human rights that are even greater risk, taking into account things like gender, age, poverty, and where we live. We have an opportunity in the near future to incorporate international covenants and treaties into domestic law. And I think that would be my plea to EIS to support this in that endeavour. And yeah, it has been a strange year of horror, but also hope, which is an unusual combination of the bigger was one. But if we don't have hope that we can use this example, this wider societal awareness of issues and what has happened, then we can move forward from that. But it will take a lot of work. And that was where I wanted to leave it, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heather. And again, sorry for cutting speakers off and just with being tight for time. And it was so important to hear from you there about the disproportionate impact the pandemic has had on disabled people, because some of what you're describing is horrifying, but it's really important that we hear it and that we know about it so we can support members, but also fight for, play our role in the wider trade union movement and equality movement to fight to ensure that kind of impact doesn't happen again. And you're right to flag up about what might happen in the future. So thank you for speaking to us this evening. Our final speaker from our panel is Dilraj Watson, the CEO of Amina, the Muslim Women's Resource Centre. Dilraj has nearly 15 years of experience as a sustainability and social justice practitioner. She has substantial programme and policy experience in urban development, spanning across subjects of environment, poverty and social capital, with a focus on gender and race mainstreaming. Additionally, she has significant background in working with marginalised groups, including BNE communities. Active interests consist of social justice causes and environmental causes. Currently, Dilraj balances responsibilities across multiple roles, one of them as a co-CEO of a Scottish Muslim BME women's charity, Amina, which works with marginalised and disadvantaged women in Scotland. So you're very welcome here this evening, Dilraj. We thank you for coming to speak to us, and I'd like to ask you to address the meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for that very gracious introduction, and thank you, yes, for the invite. I do have the honour of speaking last, so I shall try my best to keep it as riveting as my predecessors. I do not have a presentation as well, so I'm just going to be rattling through some notes, and I will endeavour to finish before 10 minutes. So just a bit about the organisation, Amina Muslim Women's Resource Centre, for the ones who don't know what we do. We offer a range of tailored support services. We've got a national helpline, which offers a listening ear, faith-based advice to women across BME, Muslim women across Scotland. We have a presence in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Dundee. And we work across areas of poverty, violence against women and girls, and under poverty, we work on financial advocacy services, skills and capacity building, ESOL delivery, and projects which look at social isolation reduction, digital inclusion, employability. And within our violence against women and girls work, we raise awareness on gender-based violence within communities we work with. We campaign and train on those issues, and we also run befriending and friendship groups. So a fairly kind of wide range of services. We are specialists when it comes to Muslim BME women's issues, but not necessarily in providing a particular bespoke service. Now, as with a number of community organizations, when we were hit, by the kind of pandemic measures, we just scrambled to kind of see what we could do. Given that the nature of our work is so rich, relational, and it's also much in person, one of the first things we had to do was go digital overnight, which is quite a challenge for a community organization because we don't have the infrastructure and resources to do this. So while we were doing that, what we thought is we'd also listen to what the community was saying, because suddenly overnight that communication channel had been cut off. So just to give you a bit of context there, we ran a series of national surveys starting early April last year, and they've kind of run through the year in different formats. We also ran what we call community conversations, if I remember correctly, about 30 to 40 of those throughout the year. And we had an outbound phone call service where we were in constant touch with some of the service users to kind of understand what the on-ground issues were. So what I'm going to quickly kind of go through today is a patchwork of what our learning was, what we were observing in the initial and the middle of the pandemic, what our response was as a community organization, because I think that's really crucial in the context of what statutory services are available out then and how community organizations like Amina fill that gap when it comes to pandemic response. And lastly, I'm kind of going to give a bit of a vision of the future where we would like to be. So within our helpline, we annually get about 1,300 calls. And what we saw was a jump in the number of gender-based violence-related calls. So as the UN, as some of you may know, the UN declared last year as a shadow pandemic because of COVID-related violence against women, increase in violence against women. And we kind of saw that indirect response as well with our service users. So going on from about 70% to 78% right at the point of lockdown. And gender-based violence, as you know, has a range of issues. So you're not just talking about physical violence, but coercive control, financial abuse. And we kind of saw a 300% increase in the rise of what we call financial crisis cases coming through. It was really anxiety-inducing, where we were getting women virtually and metaphorically at a doorstep at crisis point where they had no recourse to public funds, they didn't know where they could go, and they really needed support to stay off the streets. On the back of that, we've also seen a rise in the number of what we call complex cases, and these cases are around the issues which normally Muslim BME women would face around gender-based violence and any kind of discrimination they experience in their day-to-day life. So we've kind of seen an increase, a double increase over the last 12 to 18 months. When we kind of look at the survey data, which I mentioned, we asked questions around all things devolved matters because it affects our service users' lives. And it was a bit of a challenge because how do you kind of articulate things around work, things around finances, and in one little survey. So thank you to Glasgow University. I'd like to give them a shout out here because they really helped us kind of hone that down. And what we found was 47, we had about 150 respondents across the country where they were predominantly female, and 47% of the respondents indicated very early on into the pandemic that the work had been affected, where they'd gone unemployed. 45% said they were affected emotionally. We had a pretty high indication of mental health concerns very early into the pandemic as well. And as other speakers have mentioned, women have borne the disproportionate brunt of the pandemic right across caring responsibilities, employment, as well as well-being. Also, our service users indicated financial kind of burdens, reduced access to services, that's about 34%. Further deterioration of the physical health because of lockdown measures and not being able to access spaces which they could normally. And very interesting enough, this is based on my work I do in my other kind of jobs. What we did see was a very, very high disproportionate impact in access to green spaces, where we would, what we've seen is women or families living in households which don't have access to really clean, accessible green spaces within walking distance, which was very essential for a lot of, for all of us during lockdown. We also saw quite a few businesses being affected, and benefits as well, which some of our colleagues have spoken about. Just to kind of pull out some key comments from the survey, just to give a flavor of how these different issues manifested in people's lives. When we speak about race, we've had quotes like, "I've been disturbed by the blame culture around COVID-19 crisis." And we've seen that right across media, right from what we call BME people being highly vulnerable, yet not taking precautions, or having a higher rate of vaccine hesitancy, where you start looking at the actual numbers. The data is not really clear. So mainstream narratives around the the discrimination tied with hesitancy, tied with inequalities, created a lot more complex picture for us when we were engaging with our service users. Then we've observed issues around families and children. There have been significant challenges in women's lives, where individual circumstances have left them with very little coping mechanisms in place, where women have not even been able to get what we call some me time. And if they are digitally excluded, if they're not digitally literate, any interventions which were being offered on digital platforms were not effective, because there's no way for them to engage in that. So we kind of saw a lot of cases where women either did not have the capacity or the means to access those services, or were completely digitally illiterate and ignorant. This then had a knock-on effect on children and families. And as we all know, with children studying at home, we observed a very stark distinction, as we call it, for want of a better term, a postcode lottery when it came to the measures that were in place for children who were receiving support from schools. So whether it was in terms of equipment, whether it was in terms of school meals, and I can speak for Glasgow because that's where we kind of saw it firsthand, where the kind of south end of Glasgow was getting more support as opposed to Drumchapel and kind of the further suburbs, and that was quite stark, and was quite our service users were quite vocal about the distinction being made, and they couldn't understand why some areas had more provisions and others didn't. And we also found that the general routes of information, any information, public service information, was not reaching the communities we were working with. So we had to literally refilter what was coming through and repurpose it so that the messaging was accessible. The other thing which we really had to cope with was understandably so, the capacity gap of health and social care provision. As we all know, the BAU well-being and the medical support we would get was completely gone. And charities like us, we've had to basically step in without having the right expertise, resources, or capacity to help.
Hi, that's the 1 minute warning, sorry, thank you.
Thank you. So charities like us have had to basically fill that capacity gap overnight without having any resources. So on the back of all of that learning, we've done quite a few rapid response measures over the last year, and I was hoping to brag about them, but I will not, because what I really want to speak about is 2 points. One is one of the biggest concerns we have around the recovery model, which is currently being promoted, is it's recognizing the wider social and economic disruptions and speaking about inequalities, but what it's not recognizing is the skills gap which currently lie with the women who we work with and what the market demands are. And just to kind of really simplify that, you're talking about green recovery, we're talking about green jobs, we're talking about jobs for young people, and we all need that, no doubt. But what we are not talking about is jobs for people who do not have the skills to be able to do those jobs, or there's no mechanisms to build the capacity. And in addition to that, what we are hoping for is some more in-depth measures on supporting women, especially women, around gender-based violence, and not the kind of explicit physical aspects, but also the coercive control, financial exploitation, emotional abuse, mental abuse, and for children as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dilraj, and sorry again to come in. It's so hard because we could listen to all of you all night, actually. The subjects about which you're speaking are so vast. And again, it's really important to hear from you and thank you for sharing with us the outcome and the results from your survey. And I think it's really valuable to hear that. And I think you made such a tremendously important point about the blame culture in terms of the BAME community, and rather than understanding that we were all in that boat together, and that disproportionate of putting the blame onto one community rather than others was something that was really quite dreadful. So thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. So colleagues, that's all our panellists now, and we're going to take a break just for a few minutes to give the transcriber a bit of a rest, because as you can imagine, that's quite intensive work. So we'll take a break. Let me just see, if we said maybe 3-4 minutes, hopefully that would be okay. You will have noticed we are running a little bit behind, so we hope to run on for another 10 minutes or so if our speakers are able to remain with us. Obviously, if you have another commitment, you have to go, we would understand, but we hope you might be able to stay and respond to the questions that we've had. So colleagues, if we could come back, sorry to be so very precise, but if we could come back at say 6:14, and we'll take the questions then. So thank you everyone, just a few minutes break. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I think if we can resume, it's very strange. I'm not sure if there's anybody out there. It feels like it's just me, but hopefully you are all there. Oh, good. I see Dilraj. It's nice to see somebody. Okay, so we will resume, and I'm hoping that was enough of a break for the stenographer. So, colleagues, what we will do, because we are a little bit time pressured, is we have a couple of questions. So my intention would be I will read out both questions, and in terms of our panelists, you could respond to both or one or a bit of them, or whatever you think, or if there was something you wished you'd said before and you didn't get a chance, you could crowbar that in. So I'll ask the two questions at the same time, if that's okay, and then we'll go to our panelists, and then we'll conclude the meeting. So thank you to everyone for coming back. So our first question is from Sophia Akbar from Falkirk Local Association, who posed the question: how do we support teachers and learners to be global citizens with the ongoing censorship of the human rights abuses experienced by Palestinian people? But I suppose that could actually apply to some other contexts as well. And our second question that we'd like to put to you this evening is from Kevin McIsaac-Stevenson from Denard Primary School in Glasgow, who says that for so many of us in schools, we've witnessed incredible equality projects being sidelined to solely focus on recovery. With a skewed curriculum focused on raising attainment in literacy and numeracy, how can we make sure all the advances we have made with equality in schools are not forgotten? So the first question there about teachers and learners, how do we support them to be global citizens with the ongoing censorship? And Kevin's question about how can we make sure we don't lose all our advances in equality with a curriculum which is perhaps only focusing on literacy and numeracy. Now, I don't know if any of our speakers would like to come in first, and it's hard to tell via the online medium. I would be tempted to go to Dilraj first, seeing as you spoke last, but perhaps you would prefer some thinking time first.
Thanks, Nicola. I'm happy to go first if it helps move things. And I'll try to keep it very succinct because these are very good and complex questions. With regards to first, which is about encouraging, I think I've been speaking to my team once I've got the question, and they're all practitioners. And one thing that really kind of struck is the question is not just around individual responsibilities of learners and teachers, but it's set in a context of institutes. And the fact that at the UK level, especially down in Westminster, we aren't recognizing that institutional racism is an issue. We've got numerous case studies where we have students reporting bullying, racism in schools where where expressing political views are conflated with having extremist views. And I think for starters, schools cannot be in an apolitical environment. We do talk politics. It's about the levels and the degrees. So I would say we encourage open-ended discussions around sensitive hot issues where students who have strong beliefs and views on such topics are able to express them, and we explore them. That's a very kind of high-level response, but this is more to do with the structural challenges we have within schools and individual policies as well, and it would take another day to just explore that. We have done significant work on it, and I'm happy to give my details should Sophia want to know more about it, and happy to kind of signpost her as well.
Thank you, Dilraj. That's a very kind offer, and I'm sure Sophia would be delighted to take you up on it. So thank you. Now I could move on to Heather, unless anyone else. I mean, if I just do it in reverse order, does that suit our speakers? Okay, I'm hoping it might. So we'll go to Heather next, then, please.
Thank you. Clearly, we work in disability, men and women with disabilities as well. I think my response to that is a kind of practical one, and it reflects back on what we were saying about stigmatization and how the press and the media normalize this kind of thing. I think it would be a good experience for young people to, first of all, identify their own difference. None of us are the same. We all have protected characteristics. We are all human rights holders. And what that means, but reflecting on things in the media, for example, some of the most speculative stuff, like Benefit Street, and how people on benefits were portrayed in that. And I do realise, and having of the particular protected characteristic being raised in this question. But I think it's a good example of how people can misportray something and the impact that that has, particularly since most people on benefits are actually already working. They're in work, poverty, etc. Can I just check, did you move on to the second question as well from Kevin? Is that correct? Just very briefly for that one, I think there is an element of accountability in public authorities and education authorities recognising that they cannot lose track of the equality project which we have lost. I also think that there's a need for a collective push, and that where events like this come in, where we share experience and make connections. And also going back to the point about incorporation of conventions and how that is not going to be the solution in and of itself, but it is a huge step forward.
Thank you very much, Heather. And could we go to Jordan next, please?
Yeah, so I was thinking about the second question, and I think for me, you know, what this session has shown in particular is that inequalities have not been and are not separated from the pandemic. So the pandemic has only further enhanced and highlighted the inequalities that are experienced by different social groups, whether that's on the basis of protected characteristics or beyond protected characteristics, such as on the basis of socioeconomic status that's been highlighted, or poverty. So I think that when we're thinking about recovery and the recovery curriculum within schools, we fundamentally can't separate equalities work from that. You know, we could point to the refreshed professional standards from January, we could point to GIRFEC, we can point to the wellbeing indicators, we can point to the ethos and the principles of CFE, and we can emphasise and we can show that equalities are a fundamental part of our education recovery, particularly as we know that learners have experienced inequalities throughout the course of this pandemic, families have experienced inequalities throughout the course of this pandemic, based on as a result of a multitude of circumstances or characteristics or situations. And so I would, ultimately argue that when it comes to education recovery, we cannot do that without viewing that through inequalities lens and considering how different demographics of people and learners and communities in our school are supported through that.
Thank you, Jordan. Could I go now to Neil, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. These are quite big questions, by the way, so thanks for them. I think in terms of the second one, in terms of ensuring that advances made in equality aren't forgotten, I think it's really just up to civil society, up to trade unions, up to faith groups and others to work together to make clear to all levels of government the kind of focus that's required on tackling inequality as part of our economic recovery. And I think that point is already perhaps been lost a little bit. So to give a slightly kind of tangential example of that, so the Scottish Government in response to the pandemic committed to a young person's guarantee. So it's essentially a guarantee of a job or training and education for every young person. And that's great. Obviously, that's fantastic given the kind of impact of the pandemic on young people. What that guarantee doesn't do is guarantee young people living wage jobs, which is what we should do. Quite frankly, if you're creating jobs for young people, there should be jobs that are decent jobs that pay a living wage. And that's one example of kind of missed opportunity in the sense of prioritising a recovery over inequality rather than seeing the two as being absolutely and completely intertwined as they should be. So I suppose it's just about making that the case that recovery doesn't mean we're winding to February 2020. And it should mean, learning lessons and applying those lessons by taking different decisions. How you make that case within individual schools is probably beyond my competence, but I think on a national scale is by making that kind of united case and making linkages between trade unions, between civil society, etc., and making that call for a more kind of just economic and social recovery. That's quite a vague answer, but it is my answer. In terms of the first question, I would just briefly say that I think, I guess the key should be focused on, as Jordan said, the kind of interlinking nature of inequality and of injustice and how they kind of manifest themselves in the UK and elsewhere. And just I'll just give a bit of a plug as well, just in terms of teaching resources. we've done Challenge Poverty Week, which is the 4th to 10th of October this year. And every year we produce educational resources to help teachers at primary and secondary level talk to their children and young people about Challenge Poverty Week. So yeah, keep an eye out for that as well.
Thank you so much, Neil, for that. And last of all, because she spoke first, we're going to Emma. So Emma, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I mean, I don't have too much to add to all of the really brilliant answers from my colleagues in the equalities and anti-poverty sector, but I suppose I would reflect that on the first question, Sophia's really good question about the situation with Palestine and what is happening and how to build solidarity within the classroom. I think young people now are subject to so much more disinformation and misinformation than when I was at school, where we just had to do a bit of analysis of some of the mainstream media and work out what perspectives where they were coming from. I think now there is so much out there which is completely dangerous and hostile to young people's understanding of the world. And I don't really have any practical suggestions, but I think this is a context in which some of the trade union mindset around solidarity, around organizing together, around working in communities to think about, as others have pointed out, human rights, justice, the values that we all share, is a really valuable thing to be doing, because there is so much anti-equality sentiment being consistently expressed on social media, in mainstream papers, but also in these really deliberate state-backed misogynistic campaigns, homophobic, transphobic campaigns, and of course campaigns that are talking about conflicts in the world from a very biased and one-sided perspective. I see Jordan's just dropped something in the chat about misinformation and disinformation, so I would just underline that recommendation and wish you all well as you struggle against misinformation in the classroom.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that, and thank you to all our speakers for really some fabulous insights in your answers there, and advice and signposting resources which will hopefully be of some assistance. Just before I draw the meeting to a close, if I could just, from a more union EIS perspective, to both our colleagues who asked questions in terms of Sophia's question about censorship, I think some really good advice there in our answers, but also if colleagues are experiencing direct pressure in those kind of terms, do contact your local association for advice and support if it's something that you're experiencing. But also that, of course, with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child being brought into Scottish law, there's scope there for discussing these kind of thorny issues within a rights-based education programme. So that may be something that there's some scope there. Exactly as Emma says, unfortunately, there's anti-equality rhetoric out there in terms of all sorts of equality and political issues at the moment. And ironically, the so-called anti-woke brigade will be telling us we were the ones that were trying to cancel them, go figure. And in terms of the curriculum, just to flag up that the 3 priorities in the curriculum are literacy, numeracy and health and wellbeing, and they remain very much the 3 priorities in terms of a COVID recovery curriculum. It's been made very clear by Scottish Government, Education Scotland, local authorities, that it's literacy, numeracy and health and wellbeing. And I think the equalities agenda, the good work that Kevin's referring to, that's rooted very firmly in health and wellbeing. So I think that's a good in for colleagues in schools. If you feel your school, your local authority is focusing solely on literacy and numeracy, perhaps remind them, if you can, get your colleagues together, have a wee branch meeting, about the importance of health and wellbeing, because equalities sits very firmly in that. And if we have children and young people who are feeling stigmatised and attacked because of protected characteristics they or their families may possess, then how can they possibly participate in a recovery curriculum in terms of literacy and numeracy to the same extent when they're under attack in that regard? And the same goes for our colleagues in schools. How can they possibly support our children and young people if they too are experiencing prejudice? So I would just signpost those couple of things for colleagues. So miraculously, we seem to have caught up. Thank you so much to everybody for their time this evening. Thank you so much to our speakers. It's you know, all our speakers, I think we've learned something from all of you this evening. Some things we may have been disheartened to learn, but it's very important that we learned nonetheless. And we appreciate you must all be so very busy and so much in demand. So thank you for your time and for coming to speak to us. And I would encourage colleagues in the meeting to, you know, look a bit more into the organisations represented here this evening. Go to their websites, go to their social media. You know that a lot of them have got great resources that we can use. Some of them have been signposted here this evening already. So please do that if you have the time. I'd like to thank the EIS staff, to the Equalities Department, for everything that they did to put this fantastic event together. It's always very stressful and a lot of work, but we appreciate everything you do. Thank you to everyone, all our members, for attending this evening, and thank you also for all the work you do in advancing the equalities agenda and to trying to fight for a better world for the children and young people and for our colleagues and wider society as well. Equalities are under attack from government, from the media, from the far right, from the anti-woke brigade, and it's more important than ever that we fight for equality. What we have heard from the speakers this evening is so very worrying, but they're important conversations. And I think one thing we could say about the pandemic is that it was bad before, it's worse now in terms of many equality strands. But we must know where we are so we can fight for where we want to be. So thank you so much for your time, colleagues. Enjoy your evening. I hope those of you attending AGM enjoy the AGM, and we wish our speakers and their organisations the very best of luck and strength with their work. Thank you, everyone, and good night.